So we're on our last video for the class, and it deals with the extinguishment of debt. So there's not a whole lot of material that I'm going to present here, but the material I do present will be rather complex. It'll involve a journal entry with a lot of different moving parts. So you're going to need to make sure you pay close attention and practice some of these to make sure you have the process down, that you understand the players that are in the transaction. It's very comparable to when we looked at selling investments. So the idea of extinguishing debt before maturity, first let's talk about why we do it. If market interest rates are increasing, then this is going to imply that the carrying value of debt is decreasing on the market. Now remember, on the balance sheet, we have a locked market rate of interest. So the market rate of interest changing doesn't affect what's on my balance sheet, but what this rising interest rate means is that then we can buy back our debt at a lower cost. So let's say that on the balance sheet, we had debt with a carrying value of $800,000, and that was a $1 million face value and a $200,000 discount. Well, if the market rates rise, then this carrying value will not change on the balance sheet. So it'll still be $800,000, but we'll be able to buy that debt back for less. So let's say that we only have to spend $700,000 in order to retire that debt. Then when we go to write off the debt, we'd write off the bonds payable at $1 million. We'd write off the discount on the bonds for $200,000. And then because of the inequality between how much we paid and how much it was on our books, we get to record a gain on sale or a gain on retirement. We're not selling anything, of $100,000. So when market rates increase, it drops the carrying value of the debt in the market so that I pay less for it than it's on my books. I get to record a gain. If market rates are decreasing, we have the opposite relationship where if I is going down, that means that the carrying value of debt is going to rise overall in the market. Again, there is no effect to the carrying value of debt on my books because of the change in market rates. But now the carrying value of the debt in the market is higher. Well, what will typically happen here, if these are decreasing, firms will refinance debt. So it's not, or refund debt. It's not the case that we're going to book gains. In fact, when we go to repurchase the existing debt, we're going to have the opposite situation where our debt might be at an $800,000 carrying value on the books by virtue of a face value of $1 million and a discount of $200,000, but we're going to have to pay cash, let's say, of $1.2 million. Well, that's going to create a loss on the retirement of $200,000, but then the firm can refinance by issuing new debt at a lower interest. Because interest rates are falling overall, that means that they can now issue new debt with lower interest, which may be in their interests depending on how much the interest rates have fallen. But in this case, then we're looking at booking an immediate gain. In this case, we're looking at a long-term gain, eating a loss in the short term and getting a better rate overall for the long term. Overall, why firms might want to repurchase debt is that if you repurchase without replacing it, it lowers a debt ratio, right? All else equal, less debt makes investors happier. It makes the firm appear less risky to potential investors and to shareholders. So less debt, less leverage overall isn't bad news. So in order to account for this, we're going to have a cash outflow. That's the cash spent on buying back the debt. And the cash is going to be dependent on how much we spend, will be dependent on the market price of debt or a call option. So we're going to either look at what the market rate's doing, and we're going to use the present day market rate because we're not going to use that historic market rate that was locked in on the issue. Right now we're talking about the market rate as it's been changing over time, or a call option. And we'll look at more at those two and how they work. The carrying value of the debt issue, which is going to be the face value less the discount, or the face value plus the premium. Should have that down by now. Any specific cost associated with the buyback, that won't affect our overall gain or loss on sale, but there are certain transaction fees or perhaps legal fees with an early buyback. And we want to separately note them as expenses and not include them in this loss on retirement or this gain on retirement. So in general, what we're going to have is a firm that's going to have the cash outflow, right, the amount they pay. That's going to zero out the carrying value of the debt issue that's currently on the books. And again, we can either repurchase it on the open market, and that would just be a cash outflow at the prevailing market price. So then we would judge a present value at the current market rate. If the bonds have a call provision, it's bought at that fixed call price. And the call price is typically stated, 101, 102, 103, which means 102%, 103% of the face value of the bonds. And typically, because we're not going to have all these items net out to just be zero, there is going to be a gain or loss on the plug, and that'll be the plug for making the item balance. So looking at an example, Obby Corp has 10 million face value. So that's our FV 5-year bonds, and the price they were priced to yield 14%. So that's our I, and they have a 12% coupon. That's our stated rate. Interest is paid semi-annually, so we have to make adjustments to these rates and to the N. On June 30th and December 31st, the bonds are callable at 102, so at 102% of the face value. It says that 2 years after their issue, on January 1st, 2019, the market rates dropped to 10%. They have don't worry about this. This is from when we did this differently, so we'll just forget about the bond issue costs for the moment. The company decides to extinguish the issue and incurs $30,000 in legal and processing fees. That's an extra fee that we don't want wrapped up in the gain or sell on retirement. So do we want to purchase the bond in the open market or call the bond? The call price would be 102% of the face value because it is callable at 102. And that would equate to $10,200,000 of cash paid. The market price would be whatever the present value is at the market rate of 10%. So if the market rates drop, right, since they've dropped, that's going to mean that my carrying value will increase because it's an inverse relation to interest. So if the market rates drop, my carrying value will rise. It's not likely I'm going to want to buy them back at the market price. The market after we figure out what the present value is, notice we hold the face value, the payment constant. We have I at the new market rate of 10% adjusted because we're talking semi-annual payments, and N equals 6 at January 1st, 2019. Because now we've had 4 semi-annual payments between January 1st, 2017 and January 1st, 2019. So looking at these two prices, knowing that the present value of buying it on the market is that much and the amount of calling it is that much, clearly the call option is more favorable because we have to spend less money. So now we just put all the pieces together. we have the amount of cash we're going to spend on the call, which is $10,200,000. We have to figure out what the present value, or what the carrying value of debt on the balance sheet is at 1/1/19. So this calculation gave me what the carrying value of the debt is if I was using a 5% rate. But remember, the market rate was actually 14%. And so I would do the same present value formula, except that instead of having a interest rate of 5%, I would have an interest rate of 7%, because we're talking about a 14% market rate on a semi-annual basis. But other than that, it's the same time period, so it's the same end. The payments haven't changed. And since it's same end, payments haven't changed. The only thing we need to alter there is the interest rate. So that 7% then gives me a present value of $9,523,346 at that date, which if I then figure out the premium or discount, it's at a discount because the face value is at 10 million. 10 million less that gives me a discount of $476,654. So I know I want to get rid of the bonds at their face value. I have a discount remaining that I have to get rid of on these bonds of $476,654. I have a retirement. Excuse me. I have a retirement cost of $30,000, right? So to extinguish the issue, I would have, whatever you want to say, legal and processing expense, as long as it's separated out from my gain or loss. Now that I've separately recognized it, it won't end up in any gain or loss that I have. And it looks like I will have a loss on this transaction because of the higher amount of credits that I have. So I have, that's all right, $10,676,000. And I would subtract from that the amount of credits that I currently have. So that equates to a loss on retirement of $646,654. So that would be a non-operating expense. This would be also something that would be non-operating. They would be tied up in our retirement. And so that's not typically something that the firm would be engaged in, and not typically an expense we would see. Right. For IFRS, things are basically the same. The only difference is that they don't separately list those expenses, and that's really the only difference between the two. So looking at the next example, this Blazer Corp issue. Blazer Corp privately placed some 8-year bonds with pension fund. The bonds were callable at 102, so that gives me my call price. They have a face value of $2 million, and they pay an interest coupon of 10%, so that's my stated rate. December 31st of each year, so it's annual. The average yield on the debt was 12% when issued, so that's my I. Assume that on January 1st, 2016, so 1 year after they had been issued, Blazer called 60% of the notes. Based on this data, fill in the empty statement cells, make sure you keep your years straight. So they privately placed 8-year bonds. That means that since they're a private placement, there is not going to be a fluctuating market rate to call them at. So we're just going to, kind of focus our attention on this call value at 102 to determine the amount that they actually are retired at. Now, an easy way to sort of figure out this information, this is what I would ask you for primarily, right? Is just what's some balance sheet information, what's some income statement information. The best way to go about finding it is to create a table and then create a journal entry for that based on the information in that table. So you have this debt issue at various points in time, and the present value will change based on the inputs you put here. So when it's issued, we have $2 million of debt at a 10% payment rate, and the I is 12%. So the market rate is greater than the stated rate, which means it will trade at a discount. And we have 8 years. So when you find the present value of that, you get 801,294. At the end of the year, how do we have to modify this? Well, we just dropped the N by 1. Everything else remains the same because we haven't sold anything yet. It's the day before we decide to sell, right? New Year's Eve. And the present value at that point would be $1,817,450. That would make sense because we traded at a discount initially, and now my carrying value will rise over time. Now on 1/1/16, we're only going to have 40% of the issue left because we called 60%. So on this date, we only have 40% left. We would then adjust this to 800,000 of face value because now we sold off 1.2 million. The payment would then drop to 80,000, which is 10% of that face value. The interest rate does not change. That rate is still locked in, and we are still 7 years out. Like that one day, right? It doesn't change anything about my N. You can now reevaluate this at that point in time in order to figure out the present value at that date. Not totally necessary, but it doesn't hurt. And actually, it will just be 40% of the present value at the former date, 726,980. And then finally, a year from then, we just drop the N to 6. Everything else remains the same because we didn't we didn't buy back any more of our debt. And now the only effect would be the carrying value rising because of one additional payment being made and us amortizing the discount, the carrying value rising. All right, so filling out the rest of this information, we know now what the value of the debt would be on the balance sheet at 12/31/15. It would be $1,817,450. At the end of December 2016, we also know that it would now be $734,217 because that present value, remember, is equal to the carrying value. And the carrying value is what we report on the balance sheet when we're talking about bonds. Now, the interest expense is going to accrue based on the beginning of the year amounts, right? So the carrying value at the beginning of the year, 1,801,294 times 12% will give me my the amount of interest expense I recognize for the year, which is $216,155. And the same here, I would take this carrying value because that's the amount of bonds that are actually going to be kept on the balance sheet in the firm for the course of that year, times 12% is going to be $87,238. So now we can fill out the interest expense fields, and there is now only one more thing to do to determine the loss on retirement. Oops, not that year. This year it was 0 because we don't retire until 2016. So if I retire this many bonds on 2016, then remember I'm only retiring 60% of that issue. So 2 million times 60% gives me the 1.2 million face value that I'm retiring. If you take that $1.2 million of face value, that means that they are $120,000 payments. That means that at that day too, remember we had 12% and 7. You wouldn't even have to do this necessarily. What you could always do is just take this amount, subtract this amount, and that would give you the present value. But this is another way to determine it, just to be sure. And that present value comes out to $1,090,470. Okay. So in the retirement, we would then debit bonds payable by the $1.2 million face value. We would credit cash for the amount of cash we need to pay. Remember that these bonds were callable at 102. So if we're calling $1.2 million of face value of bonds, then we'll end up paying 102% of 1.2 million. So that's $1,224,000. We have a discount outstanding here still. It would just be the 1.2 million less that amount gives me the discount. So there's $109,530 of discount at that date. We don't have any extra legal processing fees or anything like that. And so then we just have to see whether there's a gain or a loss on the retirement. Looks like there's a small loss on retirement. So we have a loss on retirement of $133,530. How would the existence of unamortized bond issue costs have on the loss on extinguishment recorded in 2016 under GAAP and IFRS? Well, now these answers are the same because we treat the unamortized issue costs the same. Before there was slightly different. But if we had that, then remember, under US GAAP or under IFRS, either way, the issue costs will, well, under US GAAP in particular, will increase the discount on bonds payable. And so if we have a higher discount on bonds payable here, then we're going to have to recognize more of a loss on retirement, all things equal. In the case of IFRS, the IFRS treatment will decrease the bonds payable amount, which will then also increase the amount of debit we need. So it will also recognize a higher loss on the retirement. Okay. So that is extinguishing debt. And like I said, it's not anything terribly new, but it does require some definite fluency and flexibility with time value of money, calculating the discount at a period of time, calculating the carrying value at a period in time, and being able to apply that to determine how to account for the stuff. Okay, and the loss, we can fill that in, 133,530. Okay. All right, well, see you in class on Tuesday.